what I wanted people to see Water Music as is definitely a much more specific and focused place to meet and reach the right people, not necessarily just the most people. And membership/subscriptions just made a lot more sense.
I think from our perspective, it's always about putting the audience first. So, if you're packaging something in a way that is going to make it discoverable, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, as long as you're then sort of delivering on that promise and you have the content to back it up.
Welcome to Creative Independence,
a podcast by Memberful. I'm Jen Matichuk.
And I'm Cy Wilmore. In this podcast, we speak to successful and passionate entrepreneurs who have won big in the creator economy.
We believe that high-value content wins over high-view clickbait content. People will be more inclined to come back when they trust you'll create content that resonates and serves a higher purpose than just traffic.
Today, we're joined by Cherie Hu, founder of Water and Music, a research and intelligence network for the new music business. Thank you so much for joining us today, Cherie. How are you doing? You well?
Yes, doing well. Thank you both so much for having me.
Cherie took a completely different approach to music early on. She applied her love of math and quantitative analysis to music, which led to an intersection between music and tech, something that not a lot of people were or are exploring.
Water and Music, I actually believe, comes from a quote from a musician. Is that right? Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Correct. Yes. I think the origin story perfectly encapsulates this philosophy that we were just talking about. So the phrase water music comes from Quincy Jones. In 2015, he and Kendrick Lamar did an interview, a very short but very cool interview on Hypebeast, of all places. And it's on YouTube. The link's still up there. And at the very end, Quincy says, the last two things to leave the planet will be water and music. That quote had just come completely out of the blue. Like, they weren't talking about anything existential, but then Quincy just kind of came in with this gem. And I was trying to come up with a name for what Water Music originally started as, which was just my own newsletter to share my own thoughts on the music industry and aggregate my freelance writing. Completely had no idea it would grow to the level it has today, but I just wanted a name that reflected, how I understood the role that music played emotionally in my life and in a lot of other people's lives. So I just ran with that. There are also a lot of similarities in terms of terminology between water music, like flow, stream, wave. If you really want to dig in, it has proven very fruitful in terms of the all the different layers beneath that title. But yeah, it just came from that spontaneous interview.
Fantastic. And a stream, of course, is a hugely relevant word for Water and Music within the digital music business, especially. And this is something that you and I particularly have spoken about, number of streams. It's all about the digging into the data of an industry that wasn't that data driven. I think it's fair to say maybe 5, 10, and especially 25 years ago, it was quite as with a lot of creative industries, it was an arty industry. It wasn't a technological or data driven industry. And I think Water and Music is trying to bring those two things together. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, especially with music and tech. I found a lot of the work that I was doing early on as a freelance writer was just translation across industries. Yeah, people on the music, more on the music side versus more on the tech side, having very different ways of understanding success or growth, ways of communicating how you develop an artist versus develop a software product, completely different. And a lot of historical tensions in the industry have just come from that lack of translation or lack of understanding of those perspectives. So a lot of the pieces I enjoyed writing the most came from that kind of translation perspective. And in our community today at Water and Music, there are a ton of developers looking to learn more about music for the first time, like the music industry, and then people who've worked in the industry for decades, but are also curious about what new tech is coming. So it's a very, very cool dynamic to see those two groups come together.
It sounds like this mindset kind of comes from a personal experience of seeing and working and interacting with people in the music industry who maybe could see and could understand data a little bit better. Does that sound about right?
I think so. Yeah. I was just thinking about how this connects to my philosophy. There's no single anecdote really that ties to it, but just always asking why. That's very much my like default state of mind. Like, why is this happening? Like, not taking anything for granted. You know, like, why is this happening? How did we get here? Is there anything that could be done differently? And that drove a lot of my initial interest in wanting to work in music. So I had not initially planned on writing. I thought I was going to work more like behind the scenes in the music industry and like a proper role there. And I noticed that in a lot of places, people were not asking why. They were just kind of like going through. I mean, I think this can apply to any industry to an extent. It's like you're like going through the motions or just like accepting things as like the default standard and like just kind of like getting on with your day, but like not realizing that there's this like whole other world of like possibilities beyond just, you know, like what you might have to be dealing with day to day. And like working in music can be very stressful and like very fast paced. So I definitely understand that. So I also saw my role as like being that why person for people. Like, okay, sure, maybe in your job, like your day-to-day job, you don't have time to like really zoom out. That's fine. I can hopefully be that layer for you, like the bird's eye layer. The best like feedback or testimonial I can get on an article is people saying, I never thought about it this way before, or this like unlocked something completely new for me in terms of like new ways to think about the music industry, where it could go and what I can do within it. And hopefully just like opening people's minds up is like one of the main outcomes of whatever articles we put out.
The nature of Cherie's work could very easily use big name headlines, big musical artists, hot tech topics, or a combination of the two. But rather than pushing misleading content to drive traffic, Cherie sticks to her very niche topic, and this brings the right audience and members.
So I've thought about this a lot in terms of like how to describe water in music. I think enough people are familiar with more Web3 native circles. They're familiar with the word DAO enough that we do call ourselves a DAO, and like people kind of get it, but definitely like, yeah, especially outside of the Web3 world, it can be kind of confusing. And we actually recently put our new mission statement to a ratification vote in our community using our token. And the way that we reframed our mission statement was as a research and intelligence network, as opposed to just a newsletter. And we actually decided to not mention Web3 at all. Yeah, we wanted to lead with, in the mission statement at least, and like the slogan for what we were, lead with what we do, not just with the infrastructure. So like we are a network. So the word network implying like a lot of what we do and what is needed for us to be successful is like fostering better connections among people in our community so that we can foster that kind of like the knowledge exchange that we're trying to promote in the music industry. And we produce a lot of research and data and information. So that falls under intelligence. And we happen to use Web3 tools to solve some of the problems that we are interested in. For example, definitely more kind of like a more transparent crediting or contribution or reward layer for contributing to our research, and just allowing for that to be much more distributed. Like if you contributed any kind of information to any of our research projects, you can earn our token. So it's very much like representing our research as a collective effort. There are other things like just communication where Web3 tools are really bad, to be like blunt. There's like being able, there's no easy way, I think for a lot of reasons that are understandable, especially around privacy, but there's no easy way right now to communicate directly to wallet addresses, for example. So like if someone like buys your token, the only way that you can like send a message to them is if you both know that there's like a secret messaging section of like the Ethereum blockchain explorer called Etherscan. There's like a tab you could go into to send messages, but like very few people are going to dig there. So like our number one communication, actually relevant to Memberful, our number one communication channel is email. Like we are very into Web3, but like email and Discord are like the top two reasons why we're able to get anything done.
Changing the way that you're describing what you're doing versus what you're using to do the thing you're doing makes it more accessible and available to people who maybe if they saw the word Web3 or decentralized autonomous organization, they would be like, I don't know if that's for me. I don't understand any of it. Gonna leave.
Completely. Yeah, this gets into water music, which has a very specific, I think still pretty niche audience of people in the music and entertainment industries who are really interested in tech. And a lot of those people are paying for water music, I think, to improve themselves in their careers. They're not paying to necessarily gain access to or learn about inner operations or like the inner workings of how like water music is running. There are definitely some people who are interested in that who have been super helpful in like helping us streamline that, but it's a very, very small niche. If we led with that, like paying to, I guess, being empathetic to the paying members' like immediate needs and like kind of like serving those needs. If it was just like, oh, we're a DAO, that's a cool thing. Like, it could feel a bit too nebulous. So yeah, I think like even from the very beginning, pre-DAO phase for water music was always thinking about like what is like in terms of messaging around water music, like when you pay for water music, like what is the outcome for yourself and also for this community, and like how will the music industry even like look different if we are successful, and like really leading with that. And then when we first like launched our DAO model, a lot of the communication was around the fact that we were a DAO because we were still figuring it out, and it was and still is like incredibly complex and a very like drastic transition from what it was before. So we did, I think, necessarily have to spend a lot of time like kind of communicating around that, just because that was where we're spending our energy. And now we kind of have some structure in place. We, I think, can kind of go back and like kind of balance the two. But like most of our membership still does not hold our tokens, but they're still like paying to get access to information. And like I think it's important that we like always keep that like at the core. So it's more kind of like balancing the two now in terms of messaging.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you talked a little bit about how you originally started, or not maybe originally, at the same time, started having membership as a way to monetize, alongside what you're doing with Web3 and everything like that. Why did you choose membership? Is it to be more accessible to those folks, or tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I chose membership for, I think the main reason, one of the main reasons being that I did not, given the specificity of the writing I was doing and the people I was trying to reach, did not want to get into the ad business at all. There definitely is a place for that. Some of the most successful newsletters on like other like newsletter platforms, especially thinking like Substack or like a couple of like other bigger newsletters, like they lean heavily on ads that do really, really well. They also are, I think, catering to a much wider audience base, which makes that model make sense. What I wanted people to see water music as is definitely a much more specific and focused place to meet and reach the right people, not necessarily just the most people. And like membership/subscriptions just made a lot more sense as a model for people to like, I guess for two directions: for members to kind of like buy and like invest in this community, I guess, informally over time. And then also on the flip side, for me and now for the water music team to not have to like always chase views or reach as like our main metric for success that would drive our ability to make money. It's much more, are we like delivering value to this very niche and very passionate group of people?
Communities thrive with specific topics. You're creating a space that these people could not easily be a part of otherwise. Cherie has made a place for like-minded people to thrive, and that's one of the biggest benefits of membership as well.
I believe community of practice is initially an academic term, but it does apply especially to a lot of professional communities today. So it just refers to people who are doing the same things in life and come together as a community to exchange knowledge and tips on how to do that thing. So it could be like a lot of art communities are communities of practice, like where like artists of any domain, maybe across creative domains, are coming together to exchange tips, collaboration opportunities. In tech, there are many, many strong communities of practice. So how this applies to water and music, also going back to like the selfish, but also hopefully like communally beneficial reason why people pay for water music and sign up is to learn how to do their jobs better. And then people realizing that that process is best done collaboratively. Like there's no reason that we should be like working in silos, especially if we all are dealing with similar technology or are in similar career stages. So yeah, in water music, the jobs we'll have are there's a very wide range. There are artists, lawyers, I mentioned earlier, marketers, developers, people working at labels and publishers. So it's less about like people in specific roles coming together, more about like we're all trying to understand and do cooler things with XYZ technology. How are other people thinking about it maybe in a way that I haven't thought about before? And hopefully like reading our articles and also like taking part in community discussion can kind of help people get that knowledge. And then I think the practice part of the community of practice phrase is extremely important for water music, because going back to like the principle of like always publishing things that are actionable in some way. Like I want you to read this and hopefully be less confused about something, or maybe it's totally fine if you have more questions, but hopefully you also walk away with like some new tool that you can try out or some new like framework or template that you can take and like try to apply to your own career. If it doesn't work for you, totally cool. But like just giving people the tools to think about tech in hopefully a smarter way. So yeah, like self-improvement being a very collaborative process, and then that process leading to, in the forms of like articles, speaker series, leading to ways that people can actually like improve that practice in an actionable way, are like two very essential parts of the membership.
There are productive and beneficial ways to grow without having to focus on clickbaity or trendy topics, especially if the value of your content will suffer when trying to hop on a trend. Stay true to your content and your process, and the community you build will be stronger and more loyal for it.
This is very personal to me, but I realize I have trained like all of our editors so far at Water Music to think of this way. So I guess one, like within any article, I think it's very, especially like a more research heavy piece or an analytical piece, it's very important to show your work or like show how you arrive at XYZ argument. I think this comes probably from my background in like doing a lot of math proofs, which like you wouldn't immediately associate with writing, but like that, I mean, that's the whole name of the game, I think, in that discipline. It's like you have to, like, you really cannot leave any like stone or kind of logical step unturned. Yeah, so I think even like instilling that level of rigor into the writing and especially the editing process helps a ton with avoiding this kind of like clickbaity sensationalist, because usually if something is sensationalist, they're not showing their work, they're just like throwing claims out there in the hopes of getting clicks. It's just these centers are very different. So yeah, that's kind of one avenue, just like treating the editing process very seriously. And then in our community, we have for the most part, like for 95% of our Discord server, we have a very strict no shill policy. Like if you are sharing your own project, so I say 95% because we do have a pitches channel now where people can like share like early products in development or new projects that dropped, and like people are usually more than happy to give feedback if you frame it in that way, not just like buy my stuff or like listen to my new song, but like what do you all think about this, or like I'm trying to think of like how to make this project better, how to improve it. And like this is editing in a community moderation sense. So I guess it's also like leading by example. Kind of I encourage everyone on the Water Music core team at a level that's hopefully reasonable to like stay up to date in the server and like contribute to conversations where they can and kind of lead by example in the community, like show people the kinds of discussion that we're hoping to lead. And then, so that's one, leading by example proactively. And then if people are shilling, being a very relatively strict and consistent moderator, be like, oh, can you move this to the pitches channel? Or like, oh, would love for you to share more context about this project, and just like encouraging people to, I guess, like uphold the more critical, or not even just critical, just more like context driven culture around discussion that we're trying to have in the community. And a lot of that does take a lot of manual work. I think there's a reason why our first full-time hire, or our first just team hire, was a community manager or community lead. Kat is her name at Water Music, because it is a lot of manual work but I think important, and if done well, very fulfilling work to lead by example and kind of guide people smoothly through that kind of culture that we have.
So a couple things I really got out of that is, when you're thinking about your content, you want to make sure that what you're putting out there, what you're sharing with the world, people can trust you even after they visit your content and they're like, okay, this headline, it all adds up based on the research that was done to go into forming this headline. It's not clickbaity, therefore I'm going to keep coming back, which obviously continues to power your community. So that's great. And then the other thing that I got from that is that when people are sharing in your community, you're always encouraging them to bring something more than just, hey, listen, or hey, what do you think about this? It's more thinking in terms of how you are creating your content. You're researching, you're writing, you're sharing, and you're providing something of value in order to start a conversation about something. Is that true? And how did you get to a place where you could think critically like that and apply it to your community?
Both very true. And in terms of how I got to that place, so I guess given my initial entry point into music and how I was thinking about it initially, especially the math and music intersection, I think even still today, I think very academically, for better or for worse. And I feel like an academic setting and also in a writing setting, you're basically paid to overthink things, is kind of how I think about it. So I think that line, that way of just questioning, came very naturally to me. And then even before launching the paid newsletter, I had been to a bunch of conferences where by far the most interesting discussions I was having was not on panels, but on side conversations people were having after the panels at networking events or dinners, lunches, talking about them after the fact, try to unpack what was said. That was where the real insight, the real juice really came out. And that was not being showcased as the main benefit of the panel. But that is programming and insight to me as much as any official panel on a stage with an audience. So I noticed that very early on, and I was trying to think of ways to cultivate that sense of connection and connection, and also just discussion and critique online. And I wasn't finding too many places to do that in the domain I was interested in, which was music and tech. So that was a huge motivating factor to even start the membership in the first place.
While Cherie is creating a community around the intersection of tech and music with Water and Music, Jack has carved out a corner of the internet that's quite meta. Journalism about journalism.
Today, we're joined by Jack Marshall, co-founder of Toolkits.com, a destination for insight and intelligence for publishing professionals. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jack. Hope you're keeping well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Jack began his career with legacy media brands, which meant there were rigid processes, rules, and hierarchies to navigate. However, he learned how to be the best journalist he could be with a focus on sharing content in useful ways. He learned to rely on the meat of the content instead of the possible virality within outlets he couldn't control.
Working inside those sort of legacy, I don't know if legacy is the best word, but, sort of established, entrenched media brands, you get to see, I think, how that history kind of permeates everything those organizations do day to day. And I think that has good and bad, right? There's a reason that these are some of the most trusted sort of news institutions. But then at the same time, I think you see up close sort of some of the opportunities for things to be done differently, perhaps move a little bit more quickly or do things a bit more efficiently. So I think that's a key one. On a more sort of positive note about those institutions, I think just being around some of the best journalists and editors in the world and sort of cutting your teeth around those people is hugely valuable, for what sort of we're trying to do now with Toolkits. And I think for anybody who's grown up with sort of a journalism background or began their career in journalism, just because I think it's so applicable to sort of so many elements outside of journalism, in sort of the wider world, which you're seeing increasingly now, as everybody sort of becomes a content creator. I really think, from my perspective, those with a journalism background really kind of stand out, just because of the way they kind of see the world and the way that they approach content. Even just through sort of simple simple elements like just backing up writing with, sort of evidence and data and stuff like that. So, I think in a variety of ways, some of them more prosaic and then some of them a bit more sort of strategic.
Talking a little bit more about, online journalism, it's a balancing act of making sure that the headlines are catchy and the articles are shareable, but without sacrificing that substance or value. So how do you find the balance between those two aspects of writing or digital writing?
Yeah, I think for us, it's, it's tricky, especially for publishers who are relying on sort of third-party platforms for distribution. If you're trying to get attention on social media, or if you are trying to rank as high as possible in Google, there is an element that you're going to have to play to those platforms and to those algorithms. But I think for our perspective, it's always about putting the audience first. If you're packaging something in a way that is going to make it discoverable, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, as long as you're then sort of delivering on that promise and you have the content to back it up. In some respects, I think publishers that are doing a good job of getting their content found and then sort of backing that up are the ones that are succeeding currently. I think publishers that have gotten themselves in trouble are those that are relying on sort of that curiosity gap, clickbait, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, that's not a new phenomenon, but, I think audiences are getting more savvy around that. And to be honest, are running out of patience with publishers that, have kind of fooled them once, fooled them twice. And I don't think that's sort of a long-term strategy for any publisher really at this point.
The consumers are learning which are the companies that are tricking them over and over and over again.
And I think, some of that does come down to the platforms as well. We went through a period of time where, publishers were just built on the back of Facebook traffic, for example. And really what they'd figured out is how to drive traffic from Facebook to a website. But they never really sort of built out, robust content to back that up. And they were flashes in the pan. I think people made some good money doing that. But if you're trying to build sort of a sustainable long-term content business, then I think just focusing too heavily on the distribution is sort of a trap that we've seen, plenty of publishers fall down over the past 10, 20 years.
Jack was in a unique position to write about content publication due to his background in media and journalism. He has tailored his audience even further and now guides and encourages publishers to write for a specific audience instead of writing for the masses. An example, writing for those who will stick around versus those who may not. So talking a little bit more about the business of writing about writing, are there any subjects or things that don't come up in any other line of journalism that only come up in this sort of business? And is the community around toolkits.com different to the community around other industries, such as like a sports community or finance journalism?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally different because there is always an element of sort of being very meta, right? So a lot of the content we produce, we're writing newsletters about writing newsletters, or we're podcasting about podcasts. So there's always that sort of juxtaposition where we are doing sort of the very activity that we're writing about. So that's always sort of an interesting dynamic, because there is often sort of a cobbler's son has no shoes element, where in some cases, we're writing about tactics or strategies or ways that publishers are seeing success, and we're not doing it ourselves. So that's always kind of an interesting dynamic. That said, I think it's always interesting. We see this with our audience, but I think you see it with any audience really reacting to publishers covering the media, is that they struggle to delineate between sort of a publisher's content and the publisher's business. So, if a publisher is writing about advertising but has advertising on its site, there's no shortage of people on social media who are popping up to sort of talk about the irony. Or the other day we posted a piece of content that was about paywalls and registration walls, and we put it behind a paywall. So, obviously people come out the woodwork and sort of want to talk about that. So, I don't think that sort of exists in a lot of other areas of journalism. I think if someone is coming to read about sports, they're there for the content, not necessarily to kind of pick apart sort of the media in and of itself in addition to the content. So it definitely adds another layer. But, I think it's an interesting one because we also get to benefit by learning from our audience. And, oftentimes people will point things out. You could improve here because this is what we did with our site. Or there's an opportunity over here that you guys haven't covered. So in many ways, I think we try and lean into that and use it as sort of an opportunity for us.
So it becomes more of like a critical analysis within your community.
Yeah. And also, for our audience, it's people who work in media and publishing who I think just by their very nature are quite sort of curious, constructively critical, let's say. So yeah, in many ways, it's sort of the ideal audience to write for because they're not shy in sort of offering feedback. And again, for us, that sort of quote unquote community piece has been really sort of a driving force for us because we can reach out to our audience and say, A, where do you think we can improve? But B, what are sort of the topics and themes that you guys are seeing that we can sort of work into our coverage? So it sounds cheesy, but it creates a nice sort of flywheel sort of situation where the content is feeding into our product, which is then feeding into sort of feedback from the audience. And, it's a nice sort of relationship we have there.
Let's move on to kind of community and being opinionated, which is obviously being opinionated, getting your opinion across. Offering critical analysis is crucial when it comes to journalism. Say what you mean what you say kind of thing. And it's absolutely necessary in the industry. I think there's a lot of people now who there's a lot of you can't win, right? It's either fake news or kind of wishy-washy nonsense that nobody really puts a flag in the sand and says, I believe this, and that's why. So things like being opinionated with a critical analysis, absolutely crucial. But again, as you say, when it comes to community, it's about being constructive. It's about having conversations that, leave everybody feeling fulfilled, satisfied, whatever you might want to call it. So how do you make sure that your opinion gets heard without rubbing people the wrong way? How do you make sure that community stays constructive to come to a fantastic resolution, let's say, for online discourse?
For us specifically, it's about sort of approaching it, and I touched on this earlier, but approaching it with that sort of journalism mindset first and foremost. I see it as my job to be honest primarily, not to sort of evangelize. So, subscription and membership models, for example, have pros and cons, but they're not right for everybody. And that's okay. I'm not saying that everybody should be adopting those models because I honestly don't believe that. So I think it's a lot more constructive to just be honest and say, there are pros, there are cons, there are trade-offs that you're going to make here. And, I think it's easy in context, again, sort of speaking for our content specifically, it's easy for people to take sort of a tweet or a podcast interview, just sort of a snapshot and say, this guy believes this. But I think what we're trying to do is focus on serving an audience over the long run. And I think, if you're familiar with us, you will know that, we're presenting all sides of the argument to try and sort of build that credibility and build that trust with the audience. So that's sort of our approach. But I think, we're seeing publishers doing that increasingly, just sort of owning that transparency piece. In some cases, I think throwing their hands up a little bit more when they get something wrong or if they don't know. That's a fascinating thing to me about the media is like, they're incentivized to never sort of admit if they don't know something. So, I think we're seeing publishers, and Semaphore is an interesting example, which is a new publisher that launched in the past couple of weeks, trying to sort of break apart, fact from opinion. And you asked previously about trends, I think we'll see more of that. I think we'll see more of the sort of transparency piece working its way in to content of all stripes. And especially, as content creators, they have other interests as well. They're running businesses. And I think, the ones that will win are the ones that are just transparent with their audience and say, look, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And just sort of owning that a little bit more.
Membership just makes sense when you're helping people understand the business of publishing. It's a topic that everyone in the industry wants to know more about in order to get ahead of the competition. Publishers and writers need to know the trends and how to keep up with them while still remaining loyal to their voice and content.
One sort of key trend is I think we will see publishers of all stripes getting a lot more sort of specific with the products that they're offering, particularly around subscriptions. And you see this already with publishers like the New York Times, for example. What they've effectively done is kind of broken up the news bundle into sort of different products. So you can subscribe just to cooking or just to sports via The Athletic. So I think, and this isn't necessarily news, but that sort of fragmentation of the media landscape, I think, will continue. And again, I think, subscription and membership models are sort of the obvious way to power that. Part of it was born not necessarily out of necessity, but it just being the best model for us to achieve what we wanted to achieve with the specific audience that we had in mind. So, by the very nature of the content we produce and the audience that we're serving, we're not going to reach an audience of 1 million people. And that's fine. That's okay. But it does mean that, monetizing through advertising or commerce or some of these other means is more of a challenge. I think it's a numbers game. And, I think you see a lot of publishers launching today with subscription models at their core, in part because it's sort of the best way to stand up a new business. So, they might down the line sort of layer on advertising or other revenue streams, but having subscriptions at the core just gives them that base to kind of build on and grow. And, there's also just sort of pragmatic, I think, financial reasons there in that, if you're selling subscriptions in a way, you can sort of crowdfund your growth. So you don't necessarily need to go out and raise money. You don't need to have, hundreds of thousands in the bank while you're trying to reach scale to sort of monetize through other means. So, I think it's a combination of factors. But then, I also think the key one, which I touched on earlier, I think, is it just brings you that much closer to your audience. People throw the word community around a lot, but I think that is the difference in crossing that line from sort of audience to community, and figuring out how to have more of that sort of two-way relationship. And, I think subscription allows you to do that in a way that other business models maybe don't.
Talking a little bit more about, you're talking about the pros and cons of membership or anything. There are always going to be those pros and cons. What do you believe have been the biggest cons for structuring a business around a membership-based model?
Yeah, as it relates to media specifically, I think discoverability is the key one. And again, we kind of touched on this earlier with sort of social and search distribution. I think the reality is there is a trade-off there. If you're attempting to monetize through subscription, then I think you need to be okay with the fact that a portion of, traffic is going to come to your audience and you're never going to see them again. You might be speaking to a smaller audience and you've got to be comfortable with that. I think we're seeing a lot of publishers move towards freemium models for those reasons. I think a lot of publishers maybe sort of rushed into subscription models and locked up too much of their content, saw their traffic dip, saw their advertising revenue dip and kind of panicked. And now I think, a lot of them are sort of reorienting around more of a freemium model, which makes a ton of sense because you can, reserve a portion of content for paying subscribers, but then leave the rest unlocked to, help sort of grow your brand, reach new audiences, and ultimately serve a portion of your audience that may never become paying subscribers. Again, like that's okay. But I think that helps sort of satisfy all of those needs, both for you as a publisher, but honestly for your audience as well. Because, if you're trying to grow your brand and sort of get your message out there to the world, the last thing you want to do is just turn people away at the front door without giving them an opportunity to get to know you and sort of strike up a relationship of some sort, even if that's not a paying relationship.
Another one of the benefits of membership is the ability to interact with the audience, find out what they're thinking, what maybe you're doing right, what you could be doing better. Can you think of any examples of a beneficial or productive conversation with any of your readers?
To be honest, we really lean on interaction with our readers and with our audience to kind of steer basically everything that we do. Again, I think our approach is to serve the audience first and foremost. So it's not about our needs as a publisher. It's not about the needs of the business or our own personal interests. It's how can we help sort of further the audience's goals? What problems can we solve for them? And the best way to do that is to ask them. So again, we have luckily sort of found ourselves in a position where that flywheel has kind of picked up nicely. So now, we can just reach out to our audience and say, what are the trends that you're seeing? What are the themes that we should be exploring? Which A, helps sort of inform our editorial coverage, but then B, we can sort of reach out to them as sort of sources, so to speak, and work them into our coverage as well. So I think it's sort of the best model where interests are completely aligned, again, around that idea of a community and more of a two-way street, rather than sort of the quote unquote audience where it's just us speaking to you. So yeah, it makes, I think, basically everything that we do just more of a collaborative process between us as a publisher and our sort of community or readership or whatever you want to call it.
You've obviously had a fantastic and varied career, starting in the, dare we say, traditional journalism, if such a thing exists now with Wall Street Journal, kind of moving all the way through to arguably the, powering journalism, helping publishers. And the business has been an important element across a lot of that. What kind of tips would you give to people who are maybe listening in to go, oh, I think membership business is for me? What tips would you give to somebody who's looking to launch something in this industry?
Yeah, I think the point that we just touched on around sort of flexibility and diversification is key, even within subscription specifically, because, the product that you have in mind today may not necessarily be sort of the product and the content that you're delivering 1 year down the road, 2 year down the road. And again, I think that kind of plays into that sort of audience element as well. So I think maybe the second thing I would say along those lines is just to have a laser focus on serving your audience first and foremost. So, you will have preconceived ideas around, what the opportunity is, where there's sort of a gap in the, the world for your content or your product. But again, put your audience first and foremost, listen to the feedback you're getting from them. Think about the signals that you can read off of them that may not be them, specifically emailing you or filling out a survey, and just try and follow sort of their needs first and foremost and let everything else follow from there. Again, we kind of touched on this, but I think over the past 10, 20 years, we've seen a lot of publishing brands pop up based around sort of business models first and foremost. So we're going to generate traffic through Facebook and monetize it with advertising. And that's great, but you're always going to run into that issue where, where does this connect to the audience? And I think, that's a very quick way to get lost, is just kind of losing sight of who you're trying to serve, how and why you're trying to serve them. And then I think the third piece would probably be just to be comfortable with sort of slow growth. You mentioned the word sustainability, and I think that's key. Building a sustainable business probably doesn't look like hockey stick growth. And, Jen, you mentioned earlier sort of the viral one-hit wonder. That's great, where you get this, big event, but what are you going to do next week? What are you going to do the week after that? So, yeah, I would say sort of embracing slow growth, especially around subscription. And just being comfortable and confident in the fact that, you're going to grow slow and steady. But, you will wake up 365 days down the line or 2 years down the line and realize that you have, a very lucrative, sustainable business on your hands. So I think those are sort of the key sort of high level things from more of a philosophical standpoint that I would say that people should keep in mind.
Water and Music built a community around like-minded people that wanted to dig into a niche topic. Toolkits built a community around people trying to better understand the world of publishing. The common ground? Neither of them relied on clickbait or viral posts to grow. It was slow and steady, but now it's sustainable and strong. They may not have the masses behind them, but they have a loyal audience that is invested in the work they are doing. We believe that high-value content wins over high-view clickbait content. People will be more inclined to come back when they trust you'll create content that resonates and serves a higher purpose than traffic.
I'm Si.
I'm Jen.
And this is Creative Independence, a podcast by Memberful.
Thank you to Cherie and Jack for joining us today. You can find Cherie at waterandmusic.com, and you can find Jack at toolkits.com. Thank you for listening. Be sure to leave us a review, and we will catch you next time.